Good morning. Welcome to the Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment 9th webinar. And this is a late-breaking webinar on OECD's guidance on key considerations for the identification and selection of safer chemical alternatives. We welcome you. Next slide, please. My name is Lauren Hine, Director of Science and Data Integrity at ChemForward, and co-chair with my colleague, Dr. Margaret Whitaker of Tox Services of the A4 Program Committee. We have done a number of quarterly webinars and encourage you to join the A4 to engage with selecting webinars and really a really fantastic program, including planning an annual workshop, amongst many other things, discussion groups, and really an opportunity to shape the future of this rapidly emerging important field. So today's webinar is really important, and that's why it's late breaking. We had already done a quarterly webinar, but we wanted to bring you this because it's of great importance to the AA community. It's very challenging to identify safer alternatives in a complex system. Just looking for options that have different hazards from the chemical of concern can lead to regrettable substitution. And striking a balance between too much information, too little information, and finding information that supports decision-making in different product contexts. What might be safer in one application might not be safer in another. So today you'll learn about the origins and goals of the guidance, you'll understand the key elements, and share some perspectives about its utility, especially in the context of safe and sustainable initiatives globally. So first of all, we'd like to run a very quick poll before I turn it over to my colleague Meg, and that is going to just see how much exposure we've had to you have had to this document. So if you could just fill out this poll very quickly and let us know, how familiar are you with this guidance? And the results. Oh, okay. Well, we have 34% have skimmed it, 62% are not familiar with it, and just 1% are very familiar. So, and 3 have read it in detail. So this is a wonderful opportunity to have this webinar then. Next slide, please. So for the logistics, we have a very large registration today. All lines are muted. If you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand or type a question in the Q&A box, and Meg and I will be monitoring the Q&A and to capture your questions. This webinar is recorded, and like all the other webinars that we have hosted as part of the A4, it will be on the A4 website. You can go back and listen to it. And at the end of the webinar, we will launch a very short evaluation survey to help us with future webinars. So again, Meg, turning it over to you. Thank you for joining today, and enjoy the webinar and submit your questions. And thank you to our speakers.
Great, thank you, Lauren. I'm really excited that this is our 9th webinar. We started this out in October 2018, and we've just seen the momentum of safer alternatives and publications relating to it increase. We're super excited. This is our largest webinar ever. So you're helping us fulfill, Ava and Emily, one of our big goals for 2021, in addition to losing 10 pounds. So I'm here just to facilitate with Lauren. I'm going to briefly introduce Ava and Emily and let them dig into this, because this, as we've seen from the poll, we're all getting to know in advance the guidance. I spent this weekend assembling IKEA and reading my guidance. So Ava leads the OECD's program on risk management of chemicals, collaborating with member countries and stakeholders to support substitution, shift to safer alternatives, advance sustainable chemistry, and share and develop risk management tools and approaches. Emily is a senior scientist at Abt Associates who has supported US EPA and OECD on chemical risk management activities over the last decade. So we're going to hear from them over the next 20 minutes all about the guidance. So I'm very happy to introduce them. Molly will facilitate moving the slides forward. So if you turn on your cameras and I'll turn mine off, we're all ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And also thank you to the A4 group for hosting this webinar today. We're really pleased that we can be here today to share the recent work on this guidance and to reach the audience that A4 is also aiming to reach with its webinars. So this presentation today will be by myself and Emily, and so I'll initially start and then turn things over to Emily. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is the outline just of our presentation. So I'll provide some background and goals of the guidance and how we came to be working on this guidance and the people that worked on it, and introduce you to the principles of the guidance and the aims of the guidance. And then Emily will walk you through the main components of the guidance and some conclusions. If you go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit on the OECD Environment, Health and Safety Program, for those of you that are not familiar with it. So this is also known as the Chemicals Program within the OECD. So we work with our 37 member countries, but also many partner countries and stakeholders to improve chemical safety and biosafety. And from working with countries to improve the methods for human health and environment risk assessment processes and testing processes, we look towards harmonizing methods across countries so that we can save resources for government and industry and prevent unnecessary distortions in trade. But also we aim to make the policies that are used more transparent and efficient, and all of this while really improving the protection of human health and the environment. So I have on this slide our website. So everything that is produced within the OECD Chemicals Program is available free of charge on the website, all the test guidelines and guidance documents, etc. If you can move to the next slide, please. So a growing area within the OECD over the last several years has been in the area of our risk reduction program. And for example, we've been working on sustainable chemistry aspects for a couple of decades now, switching between different topics related to sustainable chemistry. And the focus there right now is on sustainable design of plastics. But we also, for example, run the OECD UNEP Global PFC Group to advance a shift to safer alternatives for perfluorinated chemicals in the context of the strategic approach to international chemicals management. Also, we've been working on substitution and alternatives assessment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then quite recently, just this year, we have formalized an official sub-body within the OECD work, the Working Party on Risk Management, which will now oversee this entire risk reduction program and continue to advance this work on at OECD. So this also includes sharing of risk management approaches between countries and elements related to socioeconomic assessment as well. If you go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the work on substitution, the goals for countries in setting up this work was really to further the tools and approaches that help to support substitution of hazardous chemicals, and also to share approaches between countries. And one of the first things that was worked on in what you'll hear referred to as the Ad Hoc Group on Substitution was the creation of the OECD Substitution and Alternatives Assessment Toolbox. So really amalgamation of different tools to support substitution. The group has also been working on different analyses over the years, and I list a couple of them here, and having biennial workshops. So if you can move to the next slide. So at the last workshop of the ad hoc group on substitution, countries and other stakeholders had a conversation about what would it make sense to do at an OECD level that could help in the field of substitution and alternatives assessment, recognizing that there are already a number of frameworks in place and guidance documents, and so what could be value added. And it was decided that what would really help is guidance on what constitutes a safer alternative. So when we're all talking about shifting to something safer, what does that mean? And are we all talking about the same thing? You can move to the next slide, please. So this led then to the development of this guidance document that we're discussing today. So the guidance on key considerations for the identification and selection of safer chemical alternatives. And the goals of the guidance are really, as I said, to define safer chemicals, but then also have a consistent understanding of what the minimum requirements are to determine whether an alternative is safer or not. And as I mentioned, this work was done in the context of the ad hoc group on substitution. And I would really like to thank a couple of key people. So Lauren Sweet from the US EPA provided significant support to the writing and development of the guidance, as did Emily, who is presenting here today. And then I would also like to thank Molly Jacobs and Joel Tickner from Massachusetts Lowell, who also input to the writing of the guidance document. But then also many diverse members from countries and other stakeholder groups within the ad hoc group reviewed the guidance several times and provided their input into how to provide this consistent understanding. And just to let you know, we were looking this morning at which countries have downloaded this guidance document, and the top 7 countries are Germany, China, Japan, US, Switzerland, Iraq, and Mexico. So it's getting a lot of international attention, and we hope that this then does allow this advancement of consistent understanding. You can move to the next slide, please. So these are the 5 different sections that are found in the guidance, and I won't go over them in detail, but I do want to point out that one area that we won't talk about today is the self-assessment checklist. So the guidance does include tools that help also someone that is doing an alternatives assessment to see if they're thinking about all of these minimum criteria. But Emily will go through the minimum criteria in more detail in a moment. Next slide, please. So really the guidance is divided into 4 core areas where we have established the minimum requirements for the criteria and assessment practices. And so this is assessment scope, the comparative hazard assessment, comparative exposure assessment, and then integrating hazard and exposure to make a decision. And what this guidance does is it highlights what these minimum requirements are. But of course, depending on your scope, your capacity, the information that you have, you can also move towards doing increasingly comprehensive assessments. And so, and doing those increasingly comprehensive assessments can then increase your confidence in your decision-making process. But we've really tried to outline the minimum and how you can then move beyond these minimum. Next slide, please. So you'll see here on the right-hand side of this slide is sort of a scheme of different elements that go into an alternatives assessment and the decision-making process. So what this guidance is really trying to just focus on the 4 boxes that are in blue. We're quite aware that the guidance does not address all aspects, but this was the focus of the guidance. So it doesn't include things like assessment of performance or cost, or consideration of criteria for other sustainability considerations. Also, we focus mostly on single chemical substitution. And as we were all aware that there are many different alternatives assessments frameworks in place, also decision-making contexts, we've aimed to develop the guidance in a way that it can complement these different approaches. So it's not a stepwise sort of recipe book, but highlighting the different considerations to take into account. So I'll hand over to Emily now to continue with the next slide.
Great, thank you, Eva. It's a real pleasure to have worked on this guidance and present here today. So as Eva said, the guidance establishes minimum requirements for 4 core areas: determining the scope, assessing hazard, assessing exposure, and then integrating hazard and exposure to select a safer alternative. So the main goal of my presentation is to orient you to what these requirements are, both the minimum set and then ways the assessor can go beyond the minimum. So first is determining the assessment scope. Scoping is an important initial step of any AA, as it helps define and document the goals and principles that will guide the rest of the assessment. It can also help to screen out alternatives that are clearly infeasible or unacceptable from a functional, a legal, a market, or a corporate policy standpoint, thus saving valuable time and resources. So the guidance provides 3 recommended assessment practices for this scoping step. So first, include stakeholder input and concerns. So at a minimum, this should be done informally. For example, by talking to stakeholders, or by going to conferences, or by reading the literature. And to go beyond the minimum, practitioners can directly engage stakeholders, such as establishing a formal project team with external stakeholders to inform the assessment. Second, use stakeholder input to help bound the assessment. So the idea here is to identify potential human health effects, reasonably foreseeable exposure scenarios, and environmental impacts of greatest concern to help focus the assessment and to ensure that trade-offs are revealed and considered. And third, clarify goals, principles, criteria, and decision rules to focus the scope of the assessment. So in other words, the name of the game here is documenting all of these guiding principles up front in a transparent way before proceeding with subsequent steps. Next slide, please. So after the scoping step, and once viable alternatives are identified, a comparative hazard assessment often comes next. So this step of an AA seeks to answer, how does a given alternative compare to the priority chemical across an array of human health and environmental endpoints? Next slide, please. So there are different methods and approaches that can be used for assessing chemical hazard. And as Eva stated earlier, the guidance doesn't promote or prescribe a particular method. Instead, the guidance puts forth minimum requirements for comparative hazard assessments that include 4 main elements: using authoritative lists to screen out problematic alternatives, selecting endpoints and applying GHS criteria, establishing and applying decision rules, and considering data gaps and uncertainty. So I'll take each of these one by one. So next slide, please. So first, authoritative list. So these are lists developed by governments or government-recognized experts, and they're used extensively in hazard assessments. Generally speaking, if authorities have identified chemicals as problematic, then substances on these lists should not be considered safer alternatives. At a minimum, the guidance recommends screening out problematic alternatives based on 9 different authoritative lists, which are listed here on this slide. So 2 of the examples are ECHA's candidate list of substances of very high concern for authorization, and the U.S. National Toxicology Program's report on carcinogens. And then to recommend consulting additional list of chemicals and provides several examples within the report itself. Things like OECD's NGO resources like the SIN list, and resources specific to industry sectors like the ZDHC manufacturing restricted substance list. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that only a subset of chemicals have been evaluated for placement on authoritative lists, and that absence from a list is not an indication of safety. So this fact points to the value of addressing the broadest range of human health and environmental endpoints that resources and expertise allow. So for this step of a comparative hazard assessment, the guidance recommends, at a minimum, evaluating the 10 endpoints as shown on the left, using criteria from GHS to assign a level of concern. And then to go beyond the minimum, the guidance recommends assessing additional endpoints listed here on the right based on stakeholder input, data availability, and expertise. Next slide, please. So once the endpoints have been selected and GHS criteria applied, it's important to establish decision rules to select a safer alternative. So by decision rules, I mean the rules that the assessor makes upfront to provide a systematic and transparent way to support the selection of a safer alternative. So for example, avoiding CMRs, PBTs, and VPVBs is a decision rule that is consistent with most regulatory program priorities. So for example, REACH in the EU, and in the US, the criteria used by EPA's Safer Choice program to certify cleaning and other products. So as shown on this slide, the guidance recommends that at a minimum, the assessor should exclude any carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive or developmental toxicants, as well as any chemicals classified as PBTs or VPVBs. Then to move beyond the minimum, the guidance recommends excluding alternatives with high concern classification for additional endpoints, such as acute mammalian toxicity, specific target organ toxicity, and environmental hazards such as wildlife toxicity. Next slide, please. So in an ideal scenario, based on the use of authoritative lists and the exclusion of high concern alternatives, there would be at least one clear-cut, safer alternative at this point. But in reality, this is often not the case due to uncertainties and gaps in hazard data. And an important consideration in any AA is avoiding replacing a priority chemical with known hazards with one that has poorly understood hazards, often referred to as regrettable substitution. So for considering data gaps and uncertainty, the guidance includes 7 strategies. So none of these strategies is considered a best practice, and therefore the guidance doesn't recommend any one strategy over another. Rather, the guidance recommends that at a minimum, the assessor select and follow a strategy that best fits the scope and goals of the assessment, and then transparently document the decision-making process. So the full list of strategies is included within the report. A few of them are using external expert knowledge to determine if the uncertainty is problematic, to excluding alternatives with missing data, and penalizing data gaps where uncertainty for a given hazard endpoint is weighted less favorably in the overall evaluation. So next slide. Okay, so comparative exposure. So the guidance provides key considerations for conducting a comparative exposure assessment, which seeks to determine the differences in the intrinsic exposure potential of alternatives relative to the priority chemical over the entire life cycle. So a comparative exposure assessment is conducted as part of an AA. And just wanted to point out that it's different than a quantitative exposure assessment, which is typically used in conducting risk assessments. So it should be noted that a comparative exposure assessment may not be necessary if the alternatives have similar forms, use patterns, and PChem properties. But in the more likely case where properties vary, it's important to know whether these differences will impact a determination about what is safer. So the guidance lays out steps by which a qualitative exposure assessment can be carried out. So next slide, please. So the first step is identifying potential routes of exposure for the substance and each alternative given conditions of use. This step involves identifying the life cycle stage or stages where concerns for exposure trade-offs may occur, and then within each life cycle stage, identifying the potential routes of exposure and receptors given conditions of use. So this step can be done by engaging with stakeholders, reviewing the literature, or using conceptual exposure maps. Next slide, please. The second step of a qualitative exposure assessment is comparing exposure data for the alternatives. So the guidance recommends that at a minimum, the assessor exclude routes of exposure that are unlikely based on measured exposure data or PChem properties, and then qualitatively comparing data for the relevant exposure routes to determine if the alternative results in greater, equal, or less exposure. For going beyond the minimum, the guidance recommends a series of tools and references that are included in the report to help the assessor better understand use patterns and exposure pathways to assess the trade-offs. Next slide, please. The last step of an AA is selecting a safer alternative based on the results of the hazard and exposure assessments. So there are two main elements to this final step. The first element is integrating, next slide, please. The first element is integrating the hazard and exposure results. Again, there are multiple strategies and there's not one agreed upon best practice. So as a result, the guidance recommends that at a minimum, the assessor choose a strategy and then transparently document its use. So the guidance includes 4 strategies with pros and cons for each, which are listed here on the slide. And of course, these are a little hard to read, but wanted to just give you a sense of what they are. And then next slide, please. The second element is then navigating the trade-offs once the hazard and exposure results are integrated. So the guidance includes 6 different strategies for this step with pros and cons for each. So the guidance recommends that at a minimum, the assessor choose one or more of the strategies and then document decision-making in a transparent way. So some of the strategies are relatively simple to implement, such as eliminating an alternative if it scores high on any hazard endpoint, and others are more complex, such as using a weighted scoring of endpoints. Next slide, please. So in summary, for all of these minimal requirements, it's important to clearly document all decisions and strategies and to be very transparent. I think I've used the word transparent, I don't know, 10, 15 times so far. And second, as the guidance makes clear, the minimum set of criteria and practices should not in any way discourage assessors from going beyond the minimum in using more comprehensive approaches. And then probably goes without saying, as science advances and as the field advances, these criteria and practices may evolve. I'll also note that the guidance includes a case example at the end of section 3 to demonstrate how these criteria can be applied in practice. The case example is a hypothetical solvent manufacturer seeking to replace a problematic solvent with a safer alternative for use in high-performing cleaning products. And the solvent example is also referenced throughout section 3 to illustrate how the criteria apply to the individual components of an AA. So next slide, please. Okay, lastly, I wanted to provide you with a brief overview of the final section of the guidance, which is on broader sustainability considerations. So this is section 5 of the report. So while the guidance did not attempt to create minimum criteria for addressing sustainability, members of the ad hoc group felt it was really important to acknowledge the importance of sustainability and substitution decisions and point readers to additional information. So section 5 of the guidance discusses many of the sustainability trade-offs using the same case example presented in section 3. It includes resources for evaluating broader sustainability impacts, and it provides an overview of life cycle aspects relative to chemical substitution decisions. Next slide, please. So that's it for my presentation. And in closing, I just wanted to say it was a real pleasure to work with Eva, Denis, Clive, Lauren, Joel, and Molly on this report. And of course, members of the ad hoc group who provided lots of good feedback throughout the writing process. The guidance can be found at the URL listed here. So thanks for listening, and I'll now turn the presentation back to Meg and Lauren.
Great, thank you. That was a wonderful whirlwind tour with tons of details, and you made it sound really exciting and easy. I think it will be a lot easier for those of us who actually practice this, who are listening, publish in open access journals and cite to the guidance and provide interpretations. And obviously, we'll get better as we move along, but we need to get that out in the published literature with more examples to help others. Now we're going to turn on reflections on the guidance. So we want to now hear brief reflections on the guidance from the co-chairs of the ad hoc group. So I'm going to introduce 2 individuals. Denis Motte, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly. If I'm not, please correct me, is the scientific officer within the risk management unit responsible for restrictions and authorizations at the European Chemicals Agency. Also a co-chair of the group is Clive Davies. Clive leads the Safer Choice program at US EPA's Office of Pollution Prevention and Toxics. Clive also led foundational work to conduct alternatives assessments for a range of chemicals, including flame retardants, surfactants, and other chemicals. Clive, I know you don't plan to make remarks today, but we also wanted to give you the opportunity to share thoughts with folks who are participating on the call. Let's first hear from Denis and Clive, and then once you do that, I'll introduce Carl and Libby, who are practitioners, and they'll also give us their feedback, and I'll introduce them in a minute or two. So I'm turning the baton over to you two.
Thanks, Meg. Denis, am I kicking off here?
Certainly, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank all the people that Emily so cleverly named at the end of her presentation, and I have to say that really appreciated working with everyone and working with all the countries, working with the NGOs and the industry folks in development of this guidance. And frankly, while I don't think everyone agreed with everything as we went through this, I think that that we came to a good point where everyone understands what we did and why we did it. And so I think that was a great outcome. I do have to say that through the work of this ad hoc group, it was a delight to work with my my co-chair, Denis. It was a great experience, and I think that we both appreciated being able to work with Eva and to have her gentle guiding hand as we went through all this work. And thanks to everybody, Emily and Eva and Molly and everybody else who I'm not naming, so thanks a ton. I would say I think a theme here that we heard from Emily and Eva, and certainly in our group as we developed this, you know, the idea for this guidance came from our ad hoc group, And I think that when we started out, we thought, yes, this is going to be a very valuable guidance for people who do this kind of work. But when we actually got down to doing the work to put this together, I think that fact was put into stark relief. I think that this guidance, because of the choices that we had to make when we put it together, the places that we had to look to find the information and then assemble it in a sensible way so that there was a stepwise approach to relatively quickly conducting an alternatives assessment. So as we did that, we found, people really are going to appreciate this because it really does give you a way of being able to relatively quickly say, this is a safer alternative, and this how I came up with that decision. How do I document that? Do it the way that this guidance says. So I was really pleased, and I felt like we'd chosen the right job to do, frankly. A word to folks who are doing alternatives assessment. I think that consensus is the best and highest way of moving forward on something like this, but that is extraordinarily time intensive and may not be within the resources that you've got for your project, whoever it is who's using this guidance. So a second approach is to take comment from people, respond to those comments, not try to have everyone exactly on the same page, but to at least make sure that you have heard everyone, understand their concerns, and have had a dialogue with them about those concerns. And if you're not able to do that, either of those things, what this guidance will do is give you a tool to be transparent about how you've made your choices and how to tell people, okay, this is why I chose what I chose. And it is a very high bar still, and a good way to communicate with people about what you've done with stakeholder groups. I think the last thing that I want to say is what is safer as a safer chemical, a relative term. Well, if you think about this in the context of sustainability, sustainability is a big picture, and saying that you have a sustainable alternative is a very good thing. But my view, and I think that the view of a lot of folks in our group, is that you can't say that you have a sustainable alternative if you don't have as a starting point a safer set of chemicals that are part of that alternative. Think about audiences when you think about safer versus sustainable. How would it look in the Washington Post if my message was that I have a sustainable product, but that product contains, for example, a carcinogen or some other problematic chemical? It's damaging to your sustainability argument if that's the case. So being able to say that you have safer chemistry as a starting point for sustainability, I think adds value and really helps the case as you are communicating on your work and your work in sustainability. So I'd like to thank folks for letting me make remarks. I do appreciate that, and I'd like to pass it to Denis, please.
Thank you, Clive. And I would also thank from my part everybody who contributed to this impressive work, and these have been named already several times. So I join my thanks to these people, and it was a pleasure to work with all these people along this way, and especially with Clive as well, to co-chair this OECD Ad Hoc Group on chemicals, substitution of hazardous chemicals, and with the lead of Eva. So it was a great pleasure to work all these years and on this specific project with all of you. So thanks a lot for that impressive work. And yes, I would comment a bit from a EU perspective. And of course, identifying and adopting safer alternatives is a key element in several pieces of EU legislation. But it's also a very topical element in light of the recently published chemicals strategy for sustainability from the Commission, which includes and put emphasis on the concept of safe and sustainable by design, and for which safe criteria needs to be developed. So this is a very topical theme, and I see this guidance from the OECD as a contribution to clarify these elements of what is safe, what is safer. So I think this is a useful piece of work, hopefully for all stakeholders to move into the direction and to go beyond this and to clarify a bit further all these elements. And I would be happy to see what people think about this guidance. Do they think this is useful? How they see that being implemented, or how they see that being further developed, and as Clive mentioned, how this fits into the overall sustainability aspects considerations. So yes, thanks a lot to everyone. I'm happy to hear people's view on this. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Clive. Thank you, Denis. It's good to hear your feedback. It was a lot of work and you made it look really easy. So we want to turn and hear from a few, actually two alternatives assessors who are actually in the trenches performing AAs and reviewing AAs. So Carl and Libby, may I ask that you unmute yourselves and turn on your videos, and I'll introduce each of you. So Carl Palmer is the Deputy Director of the California Department of Toxic Substances Control's Safer Consumer Products Program. Carl and his team implement the California Safer Consumer Products regulations requiring AAs for certain regulated consumer products. Libby Summer, among other accolades, is the Director of Corporate Responsibility at Bolt Threads, a materials company that is developing high-performance materials designed for sustainability for the textile and apparel industry, among others. It's great to have Libby join us, as she helped to develop the Ad Hoc Group's first product, which was a meta review of AA practices. So I want to hear from both of you and get your feedback about the guidance. So why don't you start out, Carl? I'll hide myself, and then we'll move on to Libby.
Thanks, Meg. It's great to be here. Thanks to everyone who worked on the guidance. It was great to have our staff be able to be on the Ad Hoc Group. I'm going to highlight just a few key elements I think are important from our perspective, and note that our perspective is one as a regulator. So in the California framework, which has a much broader and deeper set of requirements both for hazard assessment, exposure assessment, and decision making, the great thing about this guidance is that it still is applicable. It is simple, it's straightforward, it's clear, and it's a great baseline for looking at AA. But the things that I want to highlight are just a couple things that you've heard already today. One, transparency. As a regulator, it's always we're always evaluating someone's assertion or decision or process. And so the guidance makes it clear that it's very important to be transparent in every step of the way, both from scoping, but also in the assessments, to say what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and providing the information. I always like to say it's really important to show your work. We all heard that from our 7th grade math teacher. This is true here. And the guidance does a nice job of outlining how to do that and why to do that. So transparency is key. The other thing I think that's important is the guidance also encourages stakeholder input. And that's certainly important at every phase, but it also is important to make that the quality of the AA at the end can be judged by all the stakeholders to see how it stands up against people's expectations and their processes and understanding, and ultimately their values. So because decision making is ultimately about some of our values, and we may not all agree on that, but if we're transparent about it and we're clear about our evaluation, then we're in much better shape to start with. And so I think those are two real key parts of the guidance that are very strong, and the fact that those concepts and principles can be applied to whatever framework you're in is important. And then obviously as things evolve and the complexity increases, we can add on to this baseline to address things like economic evaluation, more LCA considerations and things like that. But it does get more complex as you go on. But if you can point back to your fundamental tenets, the fundamental criteria, your decision-making process, and be transparent about it, it's much easier to get a quality product and for everyone to understand the decision-making that comes out of it. So in that regard, I think that the guidance is very strong and clear and can be expanded, and we'll look forward to that as we move forward. I'll leave it at that, and I'll turn it over to Libby.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Yeah, some great points there. So as Meg mentioned, I'm Libby Summer. I work for Bolt Threads. We're a startup building new materials, more sustainable materials for the apparel and footwear industry. We're creating materials like mycelium-based leather and biomimetic spider silk. At Bolt, we have a routine process for evaluating potential chemicals for our materials. So we do alternative assessment all the time. And this aspect of sustainable chemistry in that broad field of alternative assessment is really critical for us. It's really exciting for me to see this guidance. When I first got involved in the safer chemistry field back in 2005, there was very little guidance on safer chemicals and little understanding of what that means. We started back in 2005 with a large group of stakeholders from government, industry, and NGOs, and dug into creating understanding about specific classes of chemicals, eventually moving to chemicals more generically. What's been really wonderful from my perspective is to see the explosion of tools and methodologies out there to put this kind of guidance into action. I'll just name a few, and there's so many out there, but EPA Safer Chemicals Criteria, the Green Screen, the Tox Services Screened Chemistry Library, Cyvera Lens, Chem Forward, the SIN List, and so much more. I think for anyone who's just starting in this field, we've come from a place where there used to be debate about the importance of safer chemistry, and now there's strong recognition of that as part of a sustainability program. We've learned that it's very difficult oftentimes to go back and retrofit a product or a process, and often expensive to replace chemicals after the fact. So using guidance like this and using some of the tools that I just mentioned early in the design process is really important. I think the debate right now has shifted to how to evaluate chemicals. And this is, I think, a great minimum starting point. Much of what we do in our assessment process at Bolt Threads is covered by this OECD guidance. And I would recommend for anyone designing a new material or a new product that they review this guidance and incorporate these concepts in a way that works for your business, in a way that works for your industry. In particular, I would say things like using authoritative lists to screen out known hazards should be a fundamental aspect of any new product or material process development. Also, things like hazard assessment and evaluating at a minimum the endpoints that are mentioned in the guidance. That's really critical to us in evaluating potential chemistry for our materials. And then, as Carl and Clive and some others touched on already, incorporating stakeholder input into that process and the criteria that you use is also, I think, a really important recommendation from this guidance. I think I'll stop there, and I think we're happy to take some questions.
Great, thanks, Libby. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. Go for it, Lauren.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Libby and Carl and Clive and Denis. We do have a few questions, but before we go to questions, I'd like to point out to everyone that if you go to the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a band that says handouts, And if you click on that, you will be able to directly open and download the OECD guidance document. So that makes it very easy for you. Just it's right under the polls and under questions, and you can get that handout there. So yes, thank you. Great questions. I appreciated all of your references to the importance of transparency. And I guess I'm not entirely sure. I guess I could really and ask Carl and Libby this first, but Emily and Eva and Clive and Denny, please feel free to jump in. So one question that came in was really about workers. Libby, you talked about, you said much of what we do is covered by this guidance. Do you think, where do workers fall into this? Do you find that this guidance is appropriate for workers as well? And should workers be more explicitly stated as part of AA guidance as stakeholders, or can you just broadly include them as stakeholders? So I'm picking on you, Libby, sorry, to start.
Yeah. You know, when I think about the word stakeholder, I think about any group, whether that's people or environment, that are touched by the work that we're doing in the production processes that we're doing. So I like the kind of expansive idea of stakeholder as not only human but non-human too. And the hazard criteria that are mentioned as minimum requirements, you know, are of course relevant for workers, of course relevant for communities that would be around a production process, and then also relevant for the environment and for non-human organisms too. So my definition of stakeholder would definitely include workers, and I think this guidance is relevant, and workers are an important part of being transparent and making decisions about hazardous chemistry.
I would just add too, Lauren, that I think the guidance addresses that by saying that the qualitative assessment requires a narrative about what the scope of the assessment is. And you may not have to do a whole life cycle assessment about every phase, but you could address why workers are or are not of concern for this particular product. And that could be done relatively simply. You may not have all the data, but it's a place to start and it should be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Great point. Thank you.
Just a quick remark on that, which is that we did have advocates for workers in our group as we developed the guidance, and that we are talking about safer chemistry here, and I think that context is important. Often when you think about workers, you think about PPE and other things, and I think just that context is a very important thing to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. This one might be a question a little bit more for Emily, but Emily, as you were speaking about integrating hazard and exposure, you mentioned the idea of using multiple approaches, and you offered a couple of approaches and with pros and cons, but you also suggested that perhaps one should use more than one approach. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is that what you intended? What if the different approaches give different results?
Yeah, I did say that, and I think in putting together that part of the report, it was really a reflection of the fact that there are a lot of strategies in use, and the strategies that we listed are included in the framework that the National Academy of Sciences developed back in 2014, I believe. And I mean, I think in most cases, an assessor will probably choose just one strategy and implement it, but it could be the case that you implement a strategy and you're not kind of getting the clarity that you need. And so you might go to another strategy to see how the results compare. So I think that's why it's worded that way in the report, just kind of in recognition that this is a really complex step, and sometimes there won't be a clear-cut answer. And so you can always try out, you know, two or more strategies.
Great, thank you. We had a hand raised from Britt McAtee. Britt, are you still interested in asking a question?
While we're waiting, do you want me to jump in, Lauren? And here's a great question that
Actually,
I think oh, you want to go ahead?
Question.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I've got. There's a great question here about what are the biggest gaps in current and emerging approach methods to translate this type of guidance into a safer environment. Did you find some really significant gaps? Where do we go next to move toward sustainability? Would anyone like to address that?
I'll take a gander at that one.
I'll jump in to start with and say that I think that the level of information that's available on chemicals is not yet at a place that enables full consideration of all chemicals. Data gaps are always an issue, and lists of problematic chemicals, while that's a tool that is recommended in this guidance and a lot of people use, that doesn't consider all the chemicals that haven't been evaluated on a good scale of green to not green for chemistry, and then rapid exposure assessment and comparative exposure assessment. So those are the pieces that I would say to start with.
Yeah, I would agree with that too, Clive. And maybe in addition to the need for rapid exposure assessment tools and data gaps around the hazards of chemicals, I would also add to that in the apparel and footwear industry, there's a real need for very cost-effective, very rapid assessment of chemicals, even if that's not a perfect sort of assessment in terms of how we might ideally want to see a toxicological evaluation of a chemical. But we're often dealing with lots of chemicals in this industry, and I think that is true in many industries. And we're not talking about the use of a single chemical, we're talking about formulations that have multiple chemical individual substances within that formulation. So the need to be able to screen those in a sufficient way, in a rapid way, in timelines that are sometimes we're talking 24 hours, that's really that quick, is a big challenge. And I think getting over that hurdle will help to increase the adoption of this kind of evaluation within our industry.
Great. Well, this has been wonderful. We've run out of time. You've left us with a cliffhanger of there's so many more things to discuss. So I'm going to turn it back to Meg to close out this session, and hopefully we'll have ongoing discussions about it in the future.
Great. Thank you, everyone. It was so interesting. Next slide, Molly. Finally, it's clear that we need an entire cadre of scientists, engineers, economists, life scientists to really make a decision about what's safer and what's sustainable. I really want each of you on the webinar today to think about joining the A4. We are the only professional association that's dedicated to advancing the science, the practice, and the policy of alternatives assessment. So we need you to be part of us. We're going to have more webinars where we can talk about how A4 members can try and implement the guidance and help you out so that your decisions can be both safer and then ultimately sustainable. So thank you, everyone. Please go to saferalternatives.org to join. It takes just a minute. You can pay right there online. And we want you to be part of our membership if you're not. Thank you again, speakers and presenters. This has been a great webinar. I've learned a lot. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Take care.